So, I made kind of a silly, half-joking short about Wicked and the hat in this scene, and people had a lot of really interesting stuff to say about it, including this one person who just yelled at me. As you can see, a lot of people had a lot to say about this short. They had a lot of strong feelings, so we're going to unpack that. The main question of the short was, why do people in this universe hate this hat so much? I also say that I'm pretty sure no one else has asked this question. Mainly because it is a silly question. I'm aware. But this is actually not the weirdest deep dive I've ever seen someone do on a scene in this movie. And there was some really interesting discussion in the comments of that short, with some people saying some really insightful things, and I wanted to highlight that. So to truly understand, we're gonna have to go all the way back to the historical aspects of this hat. I am not a historian, so I will do my best. Although the Wizard of Oz book that came out in 1900 and the film were part of what catapulted this style of hat into pop culture, this hat has been associated with witches for a long time before that. This photo is featured in the book The History of Witches and Wizards from 1720. You can also see some examples of witch hats throughout history in these old-timey Halloween photos, which are roughly dated as the late 1800s. And there are a couple of theories as to how this type of hat became associated with witches in particular. The sort of common theme I see with a lot of these theories, several of them have to do with negative depictions of persecuted groups during time periods where pointy hats just happened to be fashionable for those groups. Now onto the hat in the book. Now I was made aware in the comment section that the hat in the Wicked book is very different than the hat that we see in both the musical and the movie. So I dug out my copy of Wicked. Ha! Here she is. In the book, it's described as having orange swags and yellow lace. And they say that on the wrong head, it would look ghastly. Glinda has Elphaba try on the hat as a joke, and to Glinda's surprise, Elphaba actually looks really good in it. This scene in the book is sort of very similar to the makeover scene in Popular in the musical. It's a scene where Glinda sees Elphaba wearing this hat and acknowledges her unique beauty for the first time, and sees her in a new light. And to my astonishment, that's about as far as things went in that scene. Which, if you know anything about this book, you'll know what a shocker that is. Oh, now we have to discuss the different versions of the hat in the musical and the movie. Now, if you heard the description of the hat in the book, yellow swags, orange lace, yellow swags, I don't know, and you're like, that sounds crazy, I want to see it really bad. Unfortunately, I could not find any artistic depictions. So we're going to have to move on to the hat in the musical. Now, the hat in the musical is very angular and streamlined, which makes sense because there's a lyric describing it as sharp. Its exaggerated, severe shape works really well on stage because you can immediately tell what it is from far away by its silhouette alone. The brim is very small, possibly to keep it from casting shadows on the performer's face. It looks villainous and intense. The hat in the movie is much softer in shape, with these sort of ruffles added as well. It has a more homemade feel, with someone in my comments comparing it to a Weasley family Christmas sweater. There's something kind of sentimental about this hat, that the thought of someone making fun of it makes me very sad. More on that later. Now we get into the main question of the video, which was, why does everyone in this universe hate this hat so much when Elphaba wears it in this scene? Now before we get into this, I promise I have like a crumb of media literacy. I understand that this scene is not literally about the hat. It's about who's wearing the hat. Elphaba has already been othered in the story due to the color of her skin. People would have found a reason to criticize anything she did because of that. I understand that is the biggest piece of all of this. And clearly the reason the hat is included in this plot is to use it to illustrate Elphaba's transformation into her new identity as the Wicked Witch. And it's also just a really heartbreaking emotional scene. The movie does a fantastic job with it, and Cynthia Erivo knocks it out of the park. Give her an Oscar. But there still is a great deal of focus specifically on the hat in this scene. So here are some additional theories that provide some more context towards this hat's origins in this universe. Before we really get into this too, I'm going to add a little bit of context as to what the hat scene is. The hat is gifted to Elphaba from Glinda as a mean joke because she and her friends think the hat is very ugly. Elphaba shows up at the Ozdust Ballroom wearing it. Hundreds of people in this ballroom are just dancing and vibing, having a good time, and then one of them's just like, wait, there's an ugly hat amongst us. And then they all turn and just stare at her for like 6 minutes. The band stops playing. It's a disaster. So basically the scene is just what my anxiety tells me will happen if I take a fashion risk. Madame Morrible shows up, which I always think is really funny because, like, who invited her? It's like a secret ballroom and she just shows up. She gives Glinda a magic wand. Glinda really wants to be a sorceress at this point in the story, but she can't get into the class because Madame Morrible doesn't take her seriously. Elphaba says to Madame Morrible, give her a chance to learn magic, as a thank you for setting up her sister Nessa on a date with Bach. So Glinda realizes that Elphaba is actually a good human being. She looks over at Elphaba, who is fighting for her life on the dance floor. She thinks about how she set her up with this hat, and she feels really bad. So she goes out on the dance floor, and they dance together, and it's like a very pivotal moment in this story where they become friends. So here are some theories as to why people were so disgusted by the hat in this movie. Theory number 1. The hat is really out of style. It's mentioned in both the movie and the musical that the hat is inherited from Glinda's grandmother. But the hiccup with this is that I don't know if I buy that an out-of-style clothing item would elicit this much disgust. Now, one could say that this is sort of to highlight how shallow the Aussians are, that they would be horrified and disgusted by someone wearing an out-of-date piece of clothing. And it's understandable why Glinda and her friends don't like this hat, because they're really into fashion, they like bright colors, and the hat is black and out of style. So I understand why they would be disgusted by it. But everyone else in that scene? The Ozdust Ballroom, in the movie at least, is depicted as being in sort of a not very nice area of Oz. The students have to sneak out to go there. It's a little bit seedier, it's dark. There's animals that play music there, which in Oz are depicted at this point in the story as second-class citizens. The Ozdust Ballroom is not a snooty, high-class place. Maybe they'd stare and make a comment or two, but it doesn't really make sense to me that this crowd would be overly concerned with material items. Theory number 2. They hate this hat because they've just never seen a hat like this before. This one's kind of fun. I like to imagine that Glinda's grandmother just created this absolutely bonkers hat design that no one had ever seen before. No one could even conceive that a hat could be shaped like this, and she invented it essentially. And that could be supported by Glinda saying that the hat came from her grandmother. But the thing is, Glinda doesn't specifically say that her grandmother made the hat. The line in the musical is that her granny is always buying her the most hideous hats. And the line she says in the movie is just, "It's my granny's." It doesn't specifically say that she made it. But it is fun to imagine Glinda's grandmother just cooking up this absolutely insane hat design. And that would explain slightly why people at the Ozdust Ballroom were so taken aback by this hat, just because it was something wild that they had never seen before. And the movie version does sort of play into this by making the hat look more homemade. This makes the scene almost somehow even sadder, knowing that something made with good intentions by an old lady is being used to bully both Elphaba and mock the gift itself. And it adds another layer to Glinda's cruelty. Theory number 3. The hat is associated with a negative stereotype in this universe. This is something I had never even considered before. And the more that I think about it, it makes a lot of sense. This one might actually be the meanest, I think. This explains the outrage that this hat caused and why there was so much discomfort over it at the Ozdust Ballroom. But my question is, what kind of stereotype would this represent in this universe? My first guess is that this hat is associated with the stereotype of some kind of disgraced witch or wizard. And one might say, yeah, that's the point. The point is for the audience to look at this hat and associate it with the Wicked Witch of the West. Not a very positive character to be associated with. We as the audience know that, but the people in this universe would not understand that, unless there was some other disgraced wizard or witch that existed in Oz before Elphaba became the Wicked Witch of the West. And I'm not saying that's impossible, but it just feels kind of unlikely. There's a lyric in No One Mourns the Wicked that refers to Elphaba as the wickedest witch who ever was. So it's unlikely that in this universe, this hat is referencing another wicked witch that came before Elphaba. So to reiterate, my question with this theory is just what would this hat represent in this universe? Because the character that it's referencing in this universe doesn't exist yet. Timeline's a little wonky there. So I have to ask, what do you think? Do you think it's any one of these theories, or is there some other reason you think people dislike the hat? Even though it's a very silly thing to debate, I think it's really interesting how almost every person I've talked to about this scene has a slightly different interpretation of it. I don't know, man. I'm just a geek who likes to talk about musicals. All right, I think that's it. If you made it this far, you're a real one. As always, thank you for indulging me. See ya!